Welcome to Read Between the Lines, a book podcast. I am your host, Molly Southgate, and today I'm interviewing...
I'm Hanna Howard.
So can you tell me about your books?
Yeah, so my debut, Ignite the Sun, came out in 2020, and it is so far my only published novel, but it is YA fantasy, and it's about a girl who lives in a world that's totally dark. She's never seen the sun before. And so she discovers pretty early on in the book that she has a kind of a elemental connection to the sun, and realizes that she might have the power to bring it back to her kingdom. But so she has to go on a journey to figure out how and what and where and why and all of that.
And that is just such a cool concept in general.
Thanks.
How did you come up with that?
Very, very kind of personal reasons. I struggled the year that I drafted this book. The first time I was deep in the middle of this sort of seasonal affective disorder, anxiety, depressive period. And for me, it was really connected to the sunlight. It was sort of the middle of winter, and everything around me was dead. And I just felt like life will never return to the world or to me. And so I sort of ended up inadvertently really sort of anchoring my hope to the return of the spring. And it sort of got intrinsically linked to sunlight. And so I started to play with the idea of what would happen if there was a world that had no sunlight, and what would be the impact of that. And yeah, kind of went from there. So
I think that is so cool to have those themes throughout it. How did you consciously put the themes of mental health, like finding the sunlight in it? Or did that kind of come in the initial concept and then like really expand after, like looking back?
Yeah, I think a lot of it was unintentional. But one of my favorite things about fiction is the way that it can tell the truth without trying to, without that being its object, So I really just wanted to tell a story, but it had so much of my own experience in it, in that metaphor, that I think the mental health stuff just sort of found its way in that way. Honestly, I drafted this book in 2011, so it was long before there was any kind of a push in the YA book market for mental health representation. And I was a newbie at mental health. I had never had any struggles with anxiety or depression before. So I was really just figuring it out for myself. And there was nothing deliberate about the integration of that struggle. It just sort of happened. So
that is really cool. How have you seen the YA industry change? Because you mentioned that it's different now than 2012 with that, especially.
Yeah. I think just in so many ways, the YA and middle grade markets both are trying really hard to make room for all kinds of representation. And I think there's a huge push for diversity in every level, every kind of diversity, and that includes mental health. And, I would say probably in the last 10 years and more, but certainly in the last 10 years, there's been a cultural shift to make more room for conversation around mental health. We don't shy away from it as much as we used to. And so I think, books have done that too. And I think that people have seen the need because so many teenagers struggle with anxiety or depression or some other mental health disorder. And they need to see themselves in fiction too. And I think fiction gives you the unique tool to kind of wrestle with something without doing it head on. You sort of do it indirectly when you're reading someone else's story. So I think it gives you tools without maybe you knowing it.
Yeah, 100%. And I know I've had struggles with that before, and fiction really can really help it for exactly the reason that you were just laying out.
Yeah.
So how did you get into writing for YA? Was that something that you wanted to do all along that just sort of happened? I've had authors on before who said, I wrote an adult novel, and they said, no, this is YA, or the other way around. So.
Yeah, that's a great question. I've known that I wanted to be a writer since I was probably in 4th grade, but I started doing it pretty seriously when I was in 10th grade. and was writing adult novels then. And then I went to college and studied creative writing. And at some point in there, two things happened. One was that I read Harry Potter, not for the first time, but for the first time since I was in fourth grade. And there were more books to read at that point anyway. And then the other thing was that I was working as a camp counselor and interacting with young people more. I mean, I was a young person, I was in college, but, young readers, as I would have thought of them. And I realized, both that Harry Potter had done something really unique for the young readership in that it made reading addictive, and worth doing over other pursuits. And then I saw a lot of young kids who, like to play video games and watch TV, and those aren't bad things, but I didn't meet a lot of kids who like to read. And I knew how much reading had been important to me. And so I thought, I want to write books that make kids want to read, because I think it's really important that kids continue to read. So I wanted to do what Harry Potter had done, which was make reading something really exciting and not a chore. So that was kind of how I got into writing YA. And I think I just lucked into having a writing voice that fit.
Oh my gosh, I love that so much because it really is so important. I was always the kid that was the one obsessed with reading. And it was strange to see like that I as I got older, my friends became that way. But like when I was younger, it wasn't really like that for a while. And it's so important to have books like that can really bring kids into doing that. Yeah,
definitely.
What sort of books did you like to read when you were a kid?
When I was a kid, I was deeply obsessed with dogs as a child. And so until I was probably in middle school, I only read books of my choice that were about either dogs or animals of some kind. So that shifted. I think in middle school was when I read Ella Enchanted, which is, I still call it my favorite book of all time. And that really was another game changer for me because fairy tales opened up for me as this landscape that were almost as good or better than dog books, so then I started to explore that world, and I read, Shannon Hale's The Goose Girl and Robin McKinley and some of those other giants in the fairy tale retelling world. But yeah.
Oh, that is so cool. So from that time to now, have you ever had any times where you in your writing had to like cut out a whole scene or a whole section or a whole book or anything like that?
Yeah, absolutely. So this book, Ignite the Sun, despite being the first published book that I have, was maybe the sixth book that I wrote. And all of the others before that, with maybe the exception of one, deserve to be in the trash. So those would be examples of whole books that had to go. But Ignite the Sun, had a long incubation process. I revised it a lot of times before I found an agent for it. And then my agent and I revised it for years together. And part of that was just life events kind of getting in the way for both of us. But there were big changes. And the first round of edits I did with my agent were, I called them mental Olympics. I mean, it felt like there were just trails of dominoes everywhere that you knocked one thing over and it impacts the whole rest of the book. So I got rid of characters. I certainly got rid of scenes, changed the ending, all those things that are important for writers to do sometimes, but sometimes hard too. So, but it was good in the end.
When you were writing Ignite the Sun, did you ever, I've heard this from a lot of authors, but I've also heard the exact opposite from some. Yeah. Curious, but while you were writing it, did you feel like there were ever any things that almost you didn't choose to make, like any decisions that your characters kind of went off in a direction you weren't expecting?
Yeah, absolutely. I think Ignite the Sun is the book that made me a plotter. I had been a pantser before then. And the first few drafts were very pants. And I remember when I was drafting it, the original draft, when I got to, if you've read the book, there's a scene near the end where our main character is in this rebel camp, kind of in the northern wilderness. And when I got there, I had a plan for what the people were going to do with and for her, and they did the opposite. And I was just so shocked. Like, I had a good plan for you all. What's the deal? And that was maybe the biggest moment. But I find that happens all the time when I write.
Yeah. It's definitely an interesting part of the writing process.
Yes, it is.
Kind of switching up these questions, but what writer do you feel is most like you writing wise? Like, if you're just purely looking at writing style, tone choices, that kind of thing.
Yeah. So a few would come to mind. One of them is my very good friend, Joanna Ruth Meyer, who's written almost 5 published books now. Echo North is her best known. Beneath the Haunting Sea is her first. Wind Daughter is the new one that's coming out. But she and I have a very similar fondness for lyrical kind of prosy writing. Another would be Rebecca Ross, who wrote The Queen's Rising and Sisters of Sword and Song, and some others that have come out more recently. She also has very kind of old world, I don't know, wordy, big word writing. I think we're all writers who love the lyrical rhythm of words. And I would say none of us are just snapping through our prose. It's all very intentional, but I think with all of those writers, Anna Bright would be another one you feel is sort of, I don't know, just in maybe an indulgent joy in the words themselves. So yeah, prosy, I think, would be a word that I would describe my writing and those as well.
Oh, that's awesome. Like an almost more of a poetic style.
Yeah, I think there's just a lot of, I think we all those writers would place a lot of value on descriptive prose and finding the right words to describe what you want to say, and wanting to paint an image and a beautiful one if possible. So yeah, I don't think there's just two camps, but there are writers who really get you through the pacing. I think that it can feel more tight and clipped and maybe even more exciting. And then I think there are those of us who kind of linger on the paths of language and really kind of dwell there a bit. So.
Yeah, absolutely. When you're writing, do you usually start with like a word or a phrase or something like that? Because as you were just saying that you like to lean into the description, or do you typically start with an image?
Yeah, it depends on the story for sure. I think maybe the challenge for people who like to be wordy is that you don't want to weigh your reader down at the same time. You do want to keep the plot moving and the pace moving. And so I don't know, it's not always a difficulty, but sometimes it's a difficulty to spend the time saying what you want to say in the way that you want to say it, and also keep the reader interested, and moving along, especially in YA, because we're not, this is not adult literary fiction where you really can afford to take whole pages and chapters to describe something. So, yeah. I think, I don't know. I think beginning with an image can be nice. I think beginning with action is also nice, but it's also just fun to see, how can I try and make even something that is, a fast paced moment beautiful, with words, so.
Yeah, absolutely. That's something that I've noticed because I write music. That's something that I've noticed in like songwriting, trying to keep the pace up, but also kind of stopping to notice all the details happening.
Yeah, I love that.
So on your website, I was reading on there, and you said that you also have dabbled in and really like worked in, dabbled is not the right word, but worked in physical art as well.
Yeah.
So how is that like played into your writing? And if it has, if so, do you have a favorite of the two mediums?
Yeah. So it's funny. I didn't ever intend to become a physical artist. My dad was, we grew up and he was self-employed. He painted tile for a living and, supported a 5-person family that way. But it was a lot of toil and trouble. And so I always looked at what he did and I said, I don't want to do anything like that because it's really hard. But I've always loved art. And in college, I studied English, but art was, I took enough electives that probably I could have had a minor. And after college, I wanted to become a writer. And so I set off trying to get published. And I mean, it's hard to get published. I found out quickly. And so on that long road, I had a handful of jobs, but I started just dabbling in painting coffee cups. My dad had given me these paint pens that worked to heat set at a low temperature, like in an oven. So I didn't need a kiln to fire them or anything like that. So I could do it in my apartment. And so I started painting mugs just as a way to help pay the bills. And Etsy was just sort of taking off then. And I got in kind of on the early wings of Etsy. And I had some really quite successful years. But the integration was that I almost always painted literary themed mugs. So they usually had a quote from a book and then a design of some kind that correlated with it. So I always say that writing is my first love, but I loved doing that. And, it was hard to do both because when you're self-employed, the demands on your time, if you want to pay your bills, are really heavy. But no, it was a lot of fun. And I still, when I get the chance to paint mugs, I still love to do it. So.
Oh, that is really cool. Have you found that did it change your writing in any way or the other way around? Did it, because I know that sometimes when doing different types of art like that, it can crash together a bit.
Yeah. That's a great question. I think probably in ways that I maybe haven't even recognized, they probably have influenced each other. I've already, I'm always trying to find new ideas for stories that I want to write. And I have found that my personal experience is just a good place to look for ideas. I would love to write a book about a girl who paints some kind of ceramic. I think that would be really fun. Conversely, I wouldn't have had that business if I weren't a writer and a reader, because I only started doing it because I thought that I wanted to have mugs with literary quotes on them. And I thought maybe other people would too. So yeah, I think maybe one of the more direct ways that they impact each other is that when I do too much of one, I kind of want the other one. So too much with my hands and I want to work with my brain, and too much with my brain and I want to work with my hands. So.
Yeah, I absolutely get that. That's really cool.
Thank you.
Kind of bringing it back, you mentioned earlier that Ignite the Sun made you a plotter. So what sort of work did you do world building wise for the book?
Yeah, well, I did a lot of world building work, and actually I did a lot of it in advance of writing it. The becoming plotter was more about realizing that I really like to know where the story is going so that I don't have to fix a lot of mistakes after the fact. But yeah, I think one of the ways that world building for this book was a lot of fun was just playing with this hypothetical idea of what would a world be like if there was no sun. And thankfully I write fantasy, so there's magic to kind of temper things like it being uninhabitable because it's too cold and there being absolutely no food to eat because nothing grows. There are those extreme things that would happen if there was absolutely no sunlight. But I could kind of, make a medium no sunlight with the help of magic. Doing research to find out like under what conditions can plants actually grow? How much sunlight does a plant need to survive? And under what conditions do they just totally die? What would be the impact on forested landscape and over what kind of time? How long would it take for a whole forest to die and fall down without sunlight? And that was all kind of initial work to start building the world. And then I really, I don't know if I read this before I wrote this book or not, but I have read, there's no sense saving your ideas for a future book. You might as well just use them now if you have a spot for them, because you never know, like you'll have more ideas and you never know, what, whether you'll get to use them again. So in world building this world, I just went for it, and I wanted to use all the kinds of magical creatures that I thought would be interesting. So I just filled up the world with, naiads and elves, and I had a species for every element. But I had banshees and what's sort of after fawns and dragons and things like that. So yeah, it was just a lot of fun. I had a lot of fun building the world for this book, and had plenty of time to do it because it took 10 years from the first draft to publication. So
that's awesome. That I love that advice too, that to not save your ideas like that. Cause I feel like a lot of times with writing and pre-writing, especially, there's this almost scarcity in it where it's like, oh no, I'm going to run out.
Yep.
I've got to, because people don't have a finite amount of ideas.
Yeah.
They'll keep coming.
They will. Well,
this was such a great time to talk to you. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me. It was really great.
Yeah. I just have one last question, and that is, what do you have coming up?
Yeah. So, hopefully something at some point. I've written another almost 2 books, totally different, like not connected to Ignite the Sun or to each other. One of them is another YA fantasy, and one of them is an adult novel. I don't know what the future is for either of them yet. So those newses are pending. And I'm hoping to be able to share something, eventually, if not soon, but, stay tuned. Hopefully someday you'll see another book with my name on it on the shelf.
Well, everyone listening to this, be on the lookout. Good luck with those.
Thank you.
I hope that they do great things.
Thank you.
Go lots of great places. For Read Between the Lines, my name is Molly Southgate.
I'm Hanna Howard.
Let's end this the way all great stories end. Happily ever after.
The end.
Thank you for listening to Read Between the Lines, a book podcast. You can follow the show on Instagram and Facebook at Read Between the Lines Podcast, and on Twitter at RBTL Podcast. Make sure to follow the authors who I've been talking to hear all about their upcoming projects, and also because they're cool people. This show is hosted by me, Molly Southgate, and produced and edited by my dad, Rob Southgate. Read Between the Lines is a Southgate Media Group production, and you can find all the great content put on by the network at southgatemediagroup.com. You can read the story of how I and many other podcasters started in the anthology book Pod Life, which you'll find at the link in the show notes. Also in the show notes are links to buy the books featured on this episode. Using those links supports this show and the incredible authors being interviewed. Have a great week and keep reading.